Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Bava Batra Daf Kuf Lamed Vav. We're going to get started with the last question at the bottom of Kuf Lamed Hey. We were discussing yesterday the difference between a shtar kinyan, a shtar that creates a transaction, meaning I write in the shtar this land, giving this land to you, and I give you the shtar, and then that means with accepting that document, you've acquired it. It creates an act. It affects the transaction. Whereas there's a shtar that could be a shtar that usually is written, we witnessed somebody passing over the rights to someone, blah, blah, blah. And then it's just a shtar that's coming to prove that a transaction actually happened. So when someone's on their deathbed and said, write this property to someone else, we write and give them write it down in a shtar and give it to them, we assume they mean to affect the transaction with the shtar. And they didn't want to give it to them without affecting the transaction with the shtar. And if they're to die, we can't do that because ein shtar lachar mita. But if they asked us to write it down in a way that they meant, we just, right now I'm telling you, I want you to give my property to so-and-so. Remember, anytime I say that, if I'm on my deathbed, it's as if I wrote it and gave it. It's as if I affected a transaction already. And what I wanted you to write in the shtar was just to prove that, to give them strength so that they could later prove that it was theirs. That's just a shtar ra'aya, which actually can be written after my death because it's just proving what already transpired. So now the Gemara asks, Hechidami miyapet kocho. What's the language of a document? Now, the language in the document would be different than the language in a document that is creating the transaction. So the Gemara answers, well, we know from something Rav Chisda said, which we'll see on Daf Kuf Nun Bet, Keda'am Rav Chisda, and he brought this language, V'kanina mine mosif al matan tada. And we acquired it. Okay, this is the language in the shtar where the witnesses write down or claim, and we acquired it on the behalf of this person in addition to this gift, meaning this was a kinyan that was, this document was written as an addition to what was already done. Hachanami, so likewise by us, what would it be? Because here it's not written in the document. Here it's the person said, write it for me. And we don't know, did they mean, right? So basically what they said is this, I want to give this house to so-and-so and write it down. So how do we know whether the person wanted it to be written down as to affect the transaction or not? Well, just like before it said, in addition to the gift, so likewise, it's in the case where Rav Chisda said this, Hachanami, likewise here, it would say to Amal, Av ketovu v'chatomu v'havule. If the person said, I want to give this to so-and-so, and even write it down and sign it, then you can actually do it after their death. Because you added the word even, it's like, again, what Rav Chisda was talking about was something else, which where the document was written, and it depends on the language written in the document. Because it said there, and there was this kinyan that was in addition, so it means it was in addition. Af is also a word that means in addition. So therefore, then you would know that you could write it down. And in fact, Itmar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, it was said, Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, Halacha kotvim v'notzim, you can write the shtar and give it, again, only under the condition that it was clear it was a shtar raya. Like, for example, if you said, even write it down. But again, what happened was, the person said, I want to give this property, and even write it down, and then the person died. So the witnesses that were standing there can write it and sign it in that case, but not in the other case that we discussed in the Mishnah. Or I don't know, maybe it wasn't in the Mishnah, it came from the Mishnah, but it was really in the Gemara about kitvu v'tshnu. And then v'chein amar Rava, amar Rav Nachman, Rava said also in the name of Rav Nachman, which makes sense because Rav Nachman and Shmuel often go in the same, right? Rav Nachman follows the school of Shmuel, halacha kotvim v'notnim. Okay, so again, in a case where it's clear the document was only to be liyapotet kocho, to strengthen the position of the person getting the gift, but not to affect the transaction, then you can even write it after their death, but you can't write ein shtar la'achar mita. Okay, now we have a new mission. HaKotev nechasav. Now we get to how do you write a document? If you want to write a will, okay, you want to give, this is actually like a bit of a unique type of circumstance, or I don't know, tough to say exactly what the circumstances here, but we'll see. I'll read the Rashbam who gives a certain interpretation as to why someone's doing this. But what you want to do is you want to give away your property to your children in your lifetime, but you want, now what's the problem? Okay, this happens all the time, right? People say, oh, give away your money in your lifetime so you can avoid taxes on inheritance and all that. What's the problem? The problem is then you don't have access to it, right? You want to be able to have access to your property. You want to be able to benefit from it. You can't give it all away in your lifetime. You'll leave nothing for yourself. So what you want to do here is you're basically going to say, listen, I'm giving you the property, but I'm going to enjoy all the proceeds. So if I give you land, right, I'm going to sell all the produce every year and make the profits on that, but the land itself will be yours. Now, this creates all sorts of issues because who has rights to sell? What do they have rights to sell and all that? It's really like in a sense, each one owns it. In a sense, neither of them own it. So that's what we're going to be discussing here. So the case is, hakotev nechasav lebanav. Now, it doesn't have to be to your sons. It could be to anybody. But somebody wants to write away his property to his children, give it away now in his lifetime. But again, keep the proceeds for themselves. Rabbi Yehuda says, if you want to do it in this way, you have to say from today and after my death, which is clear that what you mean is I'm giving you the rights after my death. You'll have everything. But right now you're going to have the goof, the property itself, or the principal, and all the proceeds I will have until my death. So the Rashbam explains, why would you do this? Rashbam explains that Barisha, it said Isha. For example, you're healthy, you're getting married. A man is marrying a woman. What's the problem? When he gets married, okay, presumably he had a different marriage, he has other children, and now he's getting married a second time. And the problem is that when he marries this woman, he's going to promise her money in a ketubah, and all of his property will be linked to the ketubah. And he doesn't want the first sons who are already born to lose the land, that she might demand the land. So if he gifts it to them now, that property will not be linked to her ketubah, and then she won't be able to take it away from them in the future. So he's trying to protect his first son's interest. So that's a possibility. Okay, but he doesn't want to give it to them entirely because then he'll have nothing to live on. So he says, I'll live on the proceeds. So Rabbi Yehuda says, if you want to do that, you have to write mehayom ulachar mitan, that will work. Rabbi Yossi omer no tzarich. What exactly Rabbi Yossi means you don't need? Do not need mehayom, do not need lachar mitan. We'll go with the simple, we don't need mehayom. It's obvious if you say, I'm giving this to you after my death, that you mean mehayom. Okay, why is that obvious? Well, we'll see in the Gemara later. He's not so clear why it's not so clear why what Rabbi Yossi's position is. And you'll see that not only is it not clear to us, we're going to have a rabbi who says, oh yeah, I don't even understand. I think it's Rav Nachman who's going to say, I don't understand his opinion. Hakotev nechasav lebeno, in this way, la'achar moto. So now let's say you go ahead and do this. Okay, whether you're like Rabbi Yehuda and you said me'ayom la'achar mita, or whether you're Rabbi Yossi and you said la'achar mita, so we're now in this in-between situation, this land. The father can't sell the land because, right, this now precludes the father from selling the land because they're written to his son. And the son can't sell the land because the father's getting the proceeds from it. So you're kind of in limbo with this land. No one can really sell any part of the land. However, it's not really true. Because what if they did sell? Now, each one could theoretically sell their stake in it. So, machar, and this we learned, for example, if a woman sells her ketubah, remember? It's also similar because the ketubah is in the event, right? They sell basically the rights to the potential, right? What could be, or when they're married and she brings in nichse milog and he has produce and she has, but the goof is hers. We've talked about this a lot. Like goof and peyrod are owned by different people. So can you sell them or not sell them? So you could actually sell your own rights to it. So therefore, machar ha'av mechurin ad shiamut. So if the father sells it, basically what the father's selling is the rights the father has, which is to the proceeds. So whoever he sells it to can get the proceeds year after year. And as soon as the father dies, they get nothing because then even the proceeds go to the son. Machar haben en lokach behem klum ad shiamut ha'av. If the son sells the son's portion, right, or the land, which basically he has rights to the goof of the land, but he only has rights once the father dies. So basically the buyer doesn't get anything until the father dies. So what they're basically buying is, options for the future. So when the father dies, they will be able to benefit from the sale. We'll get back to that case and we'll talk about some more complicated elements of that. So first the Gemara starts off and says, why should mehayom la'achar mita work? Because we're going to see in a comparable case in a get, it doesn't work. Hatnan, it says in a case from get, and we're going to compare also in tomorrow's daf to get, because it's very similar. Ein shtar lachar mita, ein get lachar mita. Remember, we've learned this. You can't give a get after you're dead, right? So if you're trying to, a man's trying to prevent his wife from being, having to do yibum, right? He can't say, this is your get when I die. What if he says, mehayom lachar mita, mehayom lachar mita? What if he says, this is your get from now and after my death, which basically means when I die, it will have retroactively kicked in from now. So if he says this, according to the Mishnah, get ve'eno get. Well, it's a suffix, she's suffix divorced. We're not sure if the get was valid or not. Ve'im mate, now what's the relevance? Well, if he dies, and we're not sure if she's divorced or not, then if he has no children, she has to do yibum, but she can't do yibum if she really is divorced, and then it would be usher for her to sleep with the brother, right? So, this is a classic case when you're not sure. You say only chalitza, not yibum, because yibum would mean, again, yibum is allowed to marry your husband's brother in the event that you're obligated by Torah law. But if you're not obligated, and here we don't know if you're obligated, it's actually forbidden for you to sleep with your husband's brother, even if your husband's no longer alive. Arayot. So we do chalitza to get out of the situation, out of a suffix, out of a doubt. So why there is it suffix migureshet? And here we say this works. Okay, it's theoretically you should say if it works here, it should work by get, and if it doesn't work by get, it shouldn't work here. To which they say no. Let's explain why it doesn't work there. Hatam misapgalan itna ahave I chazarahave. You could say that this is a stipulation, just like you could say this is your get if I don't show up in 30 days. So this is your get if I die, and it will be in effect from now. So that would be a condition. If that's what you meant when you said this is your get from today and after I die, it actually would work. Okay, but we're not sure the reason why she's suffix migureshet is when you said, now, if this is your get mehayom la'achar mita, those are two things that contradict each other. It's either from today or it's after I die. What did you mean? Maybe you said mehayom and then you changed your mind and you said la'achar mita. So maybe la'achar mita was coming to change the mehayom. And then it wouldn't work at all because la'achar mita, right? So, because you can't give a get after mita. You can only give a get if you said mehayom la'achar mita and you really meant it. If you really meant it as a stipulation, it would be clear, you would be divorced. But since you said it in a way that we don't know whether you changed your mind or whether it was a condition, we can't say the woman's for sure divorced because we don't know what the intent was. Now, obviously, we can't ask the person because they're dead, right? But what's the difference between that and here? Gufa k'nei me'ayom peri la'achar mita. But the words me'ayom la'achar mita, when it comes to the sale here or the gift, is actually has meaning. It's not contradictory terms. What it means is I'm giving it to you from today, but I'm going to enjoy the proceeds until I die. And it's a perfectly, it's a sentence that makes perfect sense. So because of that, by our case, it's going to work. And by get, since it's unclear, it doesn't work. Now this leads to, by the way, this case, not our sugya specifically, but this Mishnah that we're quoting here about get, if what's implied from here is if someone were to say this in a way that they really did mean it, theoretically it could work. And some people suggest that when someone's going out to war or going on some dangerous something, theoretically they could do this to protect their wife from having to do chalitza. The big problem is, if it retroactively kicks in from today, then they can no longer be together as husband and wife. I can't have relations. So if it's someone who, let's say, goes out to war and comes home every few weeks, then when he's home, they can't be together. So it creates a problem. Like, why not? Because you're basically canceling the get. By being together and showing we're living as husband and wife, you're basically showing, well, we're not divorced. So it would have to be, and this is why this comes up in the army, for example, and fortunately very relevant these days, could this be used as a solution? But it's very difficult. It doesn't really work perfectly as a solution for that kind of scenario. Could be if someone's really going away for a long extended period of time, this could resolve a situation like that where you could use this. Okay, now we're gonna, again, there's a lot more in terms of the, I deal with the Gemara, not exactly all the practical ramifications of everything, but it is something that comes out of here. You can research it if you want more information. Rabbi Yossi Omer no tzarich. So now we go to Rabbi Yossi's position. You don't have to say me'ayom lachar mita. It's obvious that's what you mean. So now we're going to have a story where through the story, we're going to get to this discussion about it and what's the reason for Rabbi Yossi and do we hold like Rabbi Yossi or Rabbi Yehuda? So it starts with Rabba bar Avuha chalash. Rabba bar Avuha was sick in bed and al gabe Rav Huna and Rav Nachman. In comes to visit him Rav Huna and Rav Nachman. Amar le Rav Huna le Rav Nachman. So Rav Huna says to Rav Nachman, be'emine. So before they go to visit Rabba bar Avuha, Rav Huna says to Rav Nachman, listen, you do me a favor. When you get in there, I don't know why he didn't want to do it himself, but be'emine halachak Rabbi Yossi o ein halachak Rabbi Yossi. Can you ask Rabba bar Avuha, do we hold like Rabbi Yossi or not? So Amar le, Rav Nachman says to him, and this is why I said if you're confused, you don't really understand why he says it. Neither did Rav Nachman. He says, Hame de Rabbi Yossi lo yadana halachai be'emine. Why would I ask him that question? I don't even understand Rabbi Yossi's position. Why am I going to start asking, is the halacha like him or not? To which Rav Huna answers him, Amar le, at be'emine I halacha lo. We're going to split. You go ask him, is the halacha like him or not? Vitame ana min alach. Reason for Rabbi Yossi's position, I'll explain that to you. Okay, first go ask him, and then I'll explain this to you. Ba'amine. So he goes and he asks him, and Amar le, hachi amar Rav halacha ke Rabbi Yossi. Yes, Rav said halachat Rabbi Yossi. We actually, in fact, paskin like him. Batar de nafku, after they left Rabba bar Avuha, obviously what's going to happen, right? Amar le, so Rav Huna now does his side of the promise and says, Hainu tame de Rabbi Yossi, the reason for Rabbi Yossi is da'amal zmano shel shtar mochiach halav. When you give a shtar today, with today's date, and you say, I'm giving this to you after my death, you obviously mean, because it doesn't work really to do that, so you obviously mean from today's date. You don't need to add the word hayom. It's obvious that what you mean is from today, the property itself will be owned by you, but until death, and until I die, I'm going to get the proceeds. And therefore, you don't even need to write it because the date on the shtar proves it. And in fact, not only does Rav Huna say this, but we're going to have a brighta to prove that this is the reason for Rabbi Yossi, because we're going to have a brighta where it says Rabbi Yossi's position and the reason. Tanya Namihachi, there's a brighta to support this. Rabbi Yossi Omeri no tzarich mipnei shezmano shel shtar mochiach halav. And there you have it. Ba'amine Rava me Rav Nachman. Now Rava asked Rav Nachman the following question, and we're going to go with the fact that what they're asking here is, do Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda disagree in the following case? Okay, and we're now going to go back to talking about documents. And again, there's documents that prove that something happened, and there's documents that affect the transaction. So now Rava asked Rav Nachman, Bahakna'am mahu. What if when you promised this property to this person, you did an actual kinyan with it, okay? You did a transaction where besides writing in the document, I'm giving over this, the document actually said that we did a kinyan sudar. We did like a handkerchief transaction, or we did some sort of transaction where the person who was bequeathing, who was gifting the land to his sons, let's say, basically took two witnesses, transferred ownership to them, okay, did this act of kinyan to transfer ownership like a handkerchief kind of thing, and it was recorded in the document. Okay, so bahakna'am mahu. Would that show, now what would that show? If you did an actual transaction of like lifting a handkerchief, let's say, you're showing seriousness of purpose. You're showing, I really mean this, and I mean for it to move into their possession now, which means even Rabbi Yehuda maybe wouldn't even require the mehayom, because the fact that you did this kinyan shows seriousness of purpose that you meant for it to apply right now. Okay, so if the document where you wrote, I'm writing my property to my sons, says, and there was a kinyan that was done, and I passed it on to these two witnesses as testimony, as an indicator that I was passing it on, perhaps you wouldn't need hayom, even according to Rabbi Yehuda. And in fact, the answer is, where Rav Nachman answers him, yeah, you really don't. But now we're going to have a debate, and it's a little confusing because it's hard to understand, and even like the the people in the Gemara don't really understand, and that's why there's going to be different opinions. But this first one is really hard to understand. Rav Papi Amar, it sort of depends on the language in the shtar. So sometimes you could have a kinyan and write it down in the document that we did a kinyan and all that, and it will work. And sometimes it won't work, meaning sometimes you'll have to add hayom and sometimes you won't, at least according to Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yossi never requires it. But okay, what's the case? And this is where it gets a little hard to understand. Akniye v'kanina mine lo tzarich. Kanina mine v'akniye tzarich. We're going to take the same words and flip the order. Some people, the Rashbam claims that this is usually the language used in the beginning and one is used at the end. If you look in your ketubah, if you have a ketubah or you listen to reading a ketubah at the chuppah or anything like that, these are languages that appear in the ketubah. That the husband in the beginning is akne, if I remember correctly, but for sure at the end of the ketubah it says v'kanina mine. Okay, and the chatan does a kinyan to pass it over, and that's why after reading the ketubah, the husband passes the ketubah to the wife. So now this is the language. If it says akne v'kanina mine lo tzarich. So now it's a little unclear why there would be a difference if you did it in this order or that order. Okay, akniye means that the man says, I'm giving this over. I'm passing over the rights to my son through these witnesses. And then it says, and they did the kinyan. The other one is they did the kinyan, and then I gave them the rights to it. So some people explain what the difference is. Really hard to understand. Some people claim that the difference is that in the first case, you didn't need to say kanina mina if you already said akne. So I don't remember the ketubah. The ketubah definitely says kanina mina. I'm not sure if it says akne in the beginning. But they claim, this is homework for you to do to look at the ketubah, but they claim that this is unnecessary. At least I think this is the Rashbam, if I remember correctly. Because it's unnecessary, it's added in, and then in that order it would be unnecessary, and therefore it's added in to show, I'm really serious about this, meaning it's effective immediately. And then you wouldn't need to write hayom. But if it was not unnecessary, but necessary, because if you did it in the other order, again, it's a little hard to explain why it would be necessary in one order, not necessary in the other order, but then you would need it. Okay, that's the first explanation. Okay. Besides that, we didn't understand this. You're going to see Matkifla Rav Chanina Misura, and he questions this in a very interesting way. It's kind of funny line, and it comes up a bunch of times in the Gemara. This claim, which is always countered by a different one, but we'll see. He says, this distinction, I've never heard of this distinction. This makes such a difference. And he says, we're rabbis. We learn in the Beit Midrash. And then there's scribes, right? They're not the most learned people because they sit and write contracts all the time. They work. We learn. Well, we know everything, right? And if we don't know this distinction, how are they supposed to know this distinction? And he's basically saying we're obviously smarter than the Sofrim. We obviously know more Torah than the Sofrim, than the scribes. And you're saying this is such a big differentiation. And if the Sofer just chooses one language over the other, it's indicative of, that it applies now or it doesn't apply now. But if we don't even understand this distinction and we don't know this, how on earth do the Sofrim know this? So and if the Sofrim don't know it, then it obviously doesn't make a difference if you write it this way or that way. It doesn't show more seriousness than a purpose or not less seriousness than a purpose because the Sofer needs to know that and the Sofer doesn't know, just like we don't know. To which the response is, Shalinu l'safrei d'Abai v'yadeh, l'safrei d'Rava v'yadeh. They asked the Sofrim of Abai, and they did know this distinction. They asked the Sofrim in the court of Rava, and they did know. In other words, don't think you're so smart just because you learned in the Beit Midrash. Sometimes the people who are involved in the practical actually, right, the Sofer, that's their job to know all the ins and outs of the writing of documents. And they sometimes know them better than the rabbis do. So that's not a good difficulty. It's a great line. Teaches you a lot about life, right? You think you know everything, and the person really working in that job, even though they might not be as smart as you or they might not be as knowledgeable about other things, but they know their field. Rav Huna B'Reid Rav Yoshua Amar, but not even despite the fact that the difficulty was resolved, but Rav Huna, we're going to see different opinions here who don't think that we distinguish between the order of what it was written in. Bein akniye v'kanina minei, bein kanina minei v'akniye lo tzarich. Either which way, it shows there was a kinyan done, and that shows seriousness of purpose for it to have applied immediately, which means you don't need to add the word mehayom, even according to Rabbi Yehuda. However, if you wrote in the document and it didn't have the language of kinyan in it, it didn't say, I did a kinyan with the witnesses, but it said, Ubeduchran pitgame dahava ba'ampana, beduchran is bezichron. This is the recording of what happened before us, without saying there was a kinyan. It's just saying the witnesses are saying, this is what we saw transpire, or this person told us that he wanted to transfer the ownership rights. Then there's a machloket. Do you need mehayom, or is it not so clear that it's mehayom? Okay, and if you need hayom, it's because it's not so clear because it didn't talk about a kinyan in the wording there of the shtar. But if you did say, right, so again, Rabbi Yehuda would say you need to add the word mehayom there. And Rabbi Yossi would say, no, even then you don't need to. Even though it wasn't a kinyan, since they wrote a shtar down about this whole thing, it was obvious because there was a date on the document. It was obvious they meant for it to apply from today. And that's the only case where they have a machloket, but not if it actually mentioned words, any kind of words of a kinyan, whether the order is this way or that way. I'm a Rav Kahana. Okay, that's the sugya. But now we're going to learn that the sugya, so according to what we saw, let's just go through. Rava asked Rav Nachman, with a kinyan, will it be? Is there a machloket? And he said, no, there's no machloket by a kinyan. But then we had some differentiations depending on what kind of kinyan. Or we have Rav Huna Bar Rav Shua says any kinyan, but not if in the document it didn't mention any words of a kinyan. But if it did, you wouldn't need, right? There's no machloket between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi. Rav Kahana says, I learned this whole sugya a little bit differently. Says, Amarita, not Rav Kahana, Rav Zvid. Rav Kahana comes to Rav Zvid. Amarita, the Shmati Kametu, Rav Zvid Minhardia, when I brought this whole sugya that we just learned, all the back and forth, and who said what? I brought it to Rav Zvid in Nahardia. He said to me the following. Rav Zvid said, Amarli, Atun Hachi Matnitule. You learned it this way, but Anan Hachi Matninale, but we learned this sugya differently. The way we learned it was not that Rava asked Rav Nachman the following question and Rav Nachman answered, and then there was some back and forth by other rabbis about which case what. But in fact, it's much simpler. Rava Rav Nachman. Rava just quoted Rav Nachman as saying, "Bahak na'ai no tzarich." If you did a kinyan, it's the same conclusion. If you did a kinyan, you don't need, according to any opinion, to write mehayom. Bain akniye v'kanina minei, bain kanina minei v'akniye lo tzarich. And Rava himself passed on in the name of Rav Nachman all the details. And the details were the same way the last opinion said in the previous sugya, which is, it doesn't matter the order of kanina minei v'akniye, akniye v'kanina minei. You don't need to write mehayom. There was mention of a kinyan, that shows it applies today no matter what. But if it just said this is zichron dvarim, we're just recording things that happened before us without saying there was a kinyan, then plige. Then you have a machloket. Do you have to say mehayom malachar mita, or is it enough to not say the word mehayom because of the date and the shtar? Now we get to an outgrowth of the case we saw before. So now we go to the person actually gave the property to the son, but kept the proceeds for himself. Itmar. Now we have a machloket about the following case. Machal haben b'chayei ha'av. Now, again, what happens? The son sells it in the father's lifetime, which really the son sold. When the father dies, you will get the property. However, what happened here? Meit haben b'chayei ha'av. However, what happened? The son died first. So now the question is, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, lo kana lokach. In this case, the buyer doesn't acquire the property at all. Okay? So now, Rish Lakish Amar kana lokach. The buyer gets the property. So what happens? First, it was supposed to be that the father was going to die and then the son would get the property. And since the son already sold his rights for the property, so the rights were sold to this other person and the person gets it. But if the son died first, then the son never gets the gift because the son is dead. So if the son doesn't get the gift, then the father, right, gets to keep it. So the buyer doesn't ever get it. That's what Rabbi Yochanan says. Rish Lakish says, no, the buyer does get it. So now what's the basis of their machloket? And it's actually the basis of a machloket we've seen before. Rabbi Yochanan amar, lo kana lokeach, kinyan perot ki kinyan aguf dami. You might remember this. Okay, we're now on a bet. Rabbi Yochanan says, if you acquire the proceeds, then you also have rights while you have, okay, this is actually a bit of a different case. So let's talk about the basic case, which we'll see soon inside where we saw this before. Comes up in Bava Metzia, it comes up in Gitin, if I remember. Yeah, in Gitin. If I sell you the fruits of my tree, now the fruits of my tree are connected to my tree, which is connected to my land. So the debate is when I sold you the fruits of my tree or the produce of my field, let's say all the grains in my field that grow, do you have rights also to the goof or not? Because in theory, I sold you the proceeds, which are dependent on the land. So normally we say, I just sold you proceeds. It doesn't mean you have rights to the land. But there's a machlokes Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish whether you get rights to the land or not. So here it's a little bit different. Why is it different? Because you're not selling the proceeds. What you're actually doing is you're selling the goof and you're retaining the proceeds for yourself. So the question is, when you retain the proceeds, if you say kinyan peirot is like kinyan aguf, it's as if you have rights to the goof of the property, to the property itself. Well, then in this case, when the father left proceeds for himself, did he leave also rights to the goof? So Rabbi Yochanan says kinyan peirot is ki kinyan aguf, and therefore he left. Really, when he had only the proceeds, he really did still have rights to the goof of the land. So if the son dies, the goof of the land reverts back to the father. In other words, the idea was that when the father was going to die, the son would get it. But if the son dies first, the father retained the rights to the goof, and therefore it reverts back to him. But Rish Lakish Amal, Hana Lokach, no. Kinyan Perot Lav Kinyan Guf Dami. The father had no rights at all to the land. So when the son sold the rights to the land, he sold the rights for whenever the father dies. It doesn't matter if the son dies first or the son dies second after the father. If the son dies before the father, it makes no difference. Whenever, at whatever point of the future the father dies, the father no longer had any rights to retain to the goof of the property. So therefore, the father didn't retain any rights, and therefore the son sold all the rights. So when the father dies eventually, even after the son's death, it doesn't matter. At the death of the father, it goes to the person who bought it. So that's the big machloket here. To which the Gemara says, why do they need to bring that they have an argument here? They already argued about this somewhere else, to Itmar. And this is where we learned it, and what I just told you. If you sell your field for the produce, so for all the grains that are going to grow in this field, you can get the produce of the field. But the land itself is still mine. Rabbi Yochanan Amal Mevi v'Kore. So now what's the ramification for Bikurim? Can you bring Bikurim do you have to bring Bikurim? And when you bring the Bikurim, can you read the Mikra Bikurim? Because in the Mikra Bikurim it says, here are the first fruits of my land that I brought from my land. Now, if you don't own the land, you can't say from my land. So Rabbi Yochanan says, Mevi v'Kore, because you do have ownership over that land, because the fact that you have the proceeds and the crops grow from the ground, that means you own the ground as well. Even though they didn't sell you and you don't own it completely, but it's enough of ownership to say you can read Bikurim. Rish Lakish Amar Mevi ve'eno kore. No, you bring Bikurim, but because they are your first fruits, but it's not so clear this land is yours. Kinyan Perot is not Kinyan Aguf, and you can't say Ala Damasher Natali Hashem, right? This is not the land that I own, and therefore you can't read that. So again, we're going to read the connection, but we already know that I already explained. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Mevi v'Kore, right? The structure here is we see he says this, he says that, he says this because that, he says this because that, right? A, B, A, B. So Rabbi Yochanan says Mevi v'Kore, Kasavar kinyan perot ki kinyan aguftami. Rish Lakish Amar Mevi ve'eno kore, kinyan perot lav ki kinyan aguftami. That's just what I explained before. Each one holds by a different position. And now goes back to the question, well, if they each hold that position there, why do they need to repeat it over here? Isn't it the same thing? Well, we're going to say not necessarily. And what we're going to show is that each one could claim that maybe you would think to make a distinction. And even though I say that there, I might not say the same thing here. I might agree with the other side here. Kamash Malan, they're going to say, but they had to teach you. That's why they said it. That's why they brought their machloket here, because they wanted to teach you that it's they do in fact argue in both cases. So Amar L'cha Rabbi Yochanan. Amar L'cha means Rabbi Yochanan's not here to answer, but we could imagine Rabbi Yochanan could give this answer. Even though in a normal case where I buy the produce of a field, right, the proceeds, I actually do acquire the land. In our case, though, it might be different. Why? You might have thought. You might have thought. Now, in the case where I sold you the produce, right, and you have the produce, then you also have the land because you have access to it, and you're not willing to give me rights to the land because it's yours, you versus me. But in our case, it's a father with a child. The father gave the child the rights to the land, kept the proceeds for himself. But because it's a father-child relationship and there's this closeness, perhaps the father was willing to actually give up his rights to the goof of the land and allow the son to completely sell it if he wants to, and definitively sell it for good. And therefore, you might have thought that Rabbi Yochanan would think that if the son sold it, maybe the father was, as we say, mochel on his rights. He gave up his rights to the son to give his son more right. Therefore, kamash malam, but no, not true. Rabbi Yochanan thinks, remember, lo kana lokach. So we had to say that Rabbi Yochanan says this here because you might have thought there would be a distinction because it's a father-son relationship. Now, it happens, our Mishnah doesn't necessarily have to be a father-son, but the example given is a father-son, and probably it's most likely that someone would do this with their children, and therefore, perhaps you would think it was different. Comes the Gemara to tell you, no, Rabbi Yochanan would hold it in both cases, or it comes Rabbi Yochanan to tell you this. Now, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish Amal, what could he say? Now, even though normally, when I sell you the proceeds of my field, I'm not really selling you the rights to the body of the field. I'm only selling you, come take the proceeds. But obviously, I want the land to be owned by me. But here you would need to say, even though that's clearly the case. Now here it's the reverse. I told you in the beginning, it's the reverse. It's not that the father sold the proceeds. It's that the father retained the proceeds. Now it might be different when you're selling and when you're retaining. When you sell the proceeds of your field, you're obviously keeping for yourself the body of the field itself. However, right, in a case where you said, I'm selling you the payroll. But by us, you might have thought, the payroll here are in the hands of the person who was doing the deal. They were giving something away. Now, when you give something away, you might retain more for yourself. So in this case, when I kept the payroll, even though Rabbi Rish Lakish thinks payroll, you don't acquire the land. But if I'm keeping payroll to myself, I might be trying to retain rights to the land. That in the event that the son were to die, I get it and not some buyer that purchased it off of him. And this is the opposite logic of the previous. Even when it's your own son, perhaps you want to retain more rights for yourself. Nafshe adifale, right? Your own interests are more important to you than even your children's interests. And therefore, you might have thought that in this case, because it was retaining and not selling rights, maybe when you retain the rights to the land, maybe you retain to the proceeds, maybe you even retain rights to the land, even according to Rish Lakish. Hamash malam, that's why we had to learn here that Rish Lakish disagrees in this case as well and says, no, even though you're retaining, and we might have thought you'd be retaining more, no, you actually are giving up all your rights. You know, your rights to the goof, which means that if the son sells it, it's a valid sale no matter what. It doesn't matter if the son predeceases the father. Now we're going to have a difficulty. Eitivei Rabbi Yochanan Rish Lakish, and with this difficulty we'll finish for today. Nechasai lecha v'acharecha yirash ploni. V'acharecha yirash ploni. We learned this already. If I say my property is going to you, and after you, when you die, someone else will get it, and after that person dies, a third person will get it. Mate rishon kanash sheni, mate sheni kanash lishi. Okay, that's obvious. The first one dies, it goes to the second. The second one dies, it goes to the third. Mate sheni b'chayei rishon. But if the second one dies when the first one's still alive, it doesn't go in the order that kind of said, and it never goes to the second person, then what happens to the property? So according to this Braita, yachzeru nechasim liyorshei rishon. It remains in the property of the first heir. Okay, so I died, it went to this first person, their heirs get to keep it. It just never goes farther, it stays where it is. Now, why is this? Now, what does this have to do with our topic? The assumption is if I said I'm giving my property to one person, and then from then to the second, from then to the third, what am I really saying? What I'm really saying is you can enjoy the proceeds, and then the next person can enjoy the proceeds, but in the end, it'll go to person number 3. Meaning the goof is acquired by the third person. But along the way, the proceeds are going to go to someone else. Now, if it never goes to person 2, it'll never make it to person 3. But the main point being, person 1 really only has a kinyan payroll, not a kinyan goof. So comes Rabbi Yochanan and says the following. If according to what you're saying, kinyan perot is not kinyan aguf, which is what Rish Lakish said, then what should happen to it if it never goes to person 2, so it can't make it to 3? So who has the kinyan aguf? If person number 1 doesn't have it, then it should go back to the original person, and that's what he says. If you're right, it should go back to the heirs of whoever gave it to person 1. The original owner should get it back because person 1 never had rights to the goof. So Rabbi Yochanan says this proves my point. The fact that it goes to the heirs of the first person who inherited it shows the kinyan, and they really only had kinyan perot because it was never ultimately supposed to be remaining in that person's possession. Well, it shows that kinyan perot is kinyan aguf. And he brings that as a difficulty to Rish Lakish. To which Amar Le, Rish Lakish answers him, what do you mean? For Turgamar Rav Hoshai Bavel, he already explained, acharecha shani. When you do an acharecha, it's not exactly like we explained it. It's just kinyan perot. Acharecha means it's going to you completely. Perot and guf. It's just when you die, the kinyan perot and guf will go to the next person. And when they die, it'll go to the next person. So you can't say that about it. Rami Rabba bar Rav Huna came to Rav, and Rabba bar Rav Huna brought the exact same difficulty in front of Rav, Amar acharecha shani, and he resolved it in the same way, saying acharecha is different. The Tanya, we'll just end with this question, but doesn't it say in another? Now we're just asking a question on the Braita. The Braita that we just quoted says Yachzaru nechasim liyorshe rishon, and that was why Rabbi Yochanan brought his difficulty in Rish Lakish. He said if you were right, it should have said Yachzaru liyorshe notain. To which the Gemara says, but there's a Braita that says Yachzaru liyorshe notain. In other words, there's 2 contradictory Braitot here. How do we resolve that contradiction? And to that, the Gemara is going to answer at the beginning of the next daf, Tinaihi. Oh, that happens to be this whole issue and the machloket Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, which actually ends up being a different way to resolve the difficulty of Rabbi Yochanan against Rish Lakish, is a machloket Tanaim. Okay, so the fact that we now have 2 Braitot that each say different things, one lines up with Rabbi Yochanan, one lines up with Rish Lakish, we see that it's actually a machloket Tanaim between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish about whether kinyan perot is kinyan aguf or not, and that they now learn from this kind of rejects the acharecha shani argument and says really they actually disagree. And now we'll see tomorrow is the Braita where it's clear that there's a machloket tanaim about this, and therefore what they're saying is don't worry about this contradiction between the 2 Braitot because those 2 Braitot reflect 2 different Tanaitic opinions which match up to kinyan perot kinyan aguf or kinyan perot is lav kinyan aguf. So what we did today is we started with this about the shtar being miyapeh kocho, and in that case, you actually could write the shtar after someone's death. How do you know that? What's the language? We learned about that. Then we went to this Mishnah about do you need machloket Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda? Do you need to write mehayom lachar mitah if you want to give possessions over during the lifetime? And what you're basically doing is you're saying I'll enjoy the proceeds, but we'll give the goof to somebody else, which then leads to right. Number 1, we discussed. Is that in all cases that there's a machloka between them? Are there some cases if you did a kinyan, you wouldn't even need them? You wouldn't even need to write mehayom because it's implied. Rabbi Yossi thinks it's always implied because there's a date on the shtar. We saw that even people paskin like Rabbi Yossi, and we're lenient about this. Then we got into this whole big debate, Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, about kinyan perot kinyan aguf or not, and the relevance in our case being if the son sells his kinyan on the property but then dies, was it out of the realm of the father because the father only had perot and not the goof, in which case the sale is a valid sale? Or did the father retain, because the father had the perot, the father also had rights to the karka, which means the son really only could have sold it if in the event eventually the son will own it. But the son never owned it here because the father died after the son, and therefore perhaps the buyers really don't have any rights to it at all because the father did still have rights to kinyan haguf, and it never ended up going to the son. Then we got into why did it say that they argue here when we already had it in another place, and you could have learned one from the other. And we had a difficulty Rabbi Yochanan brought against Rish Lakish, but we resolved it, and now we're going to learn that actually the debate between them was an earlier debate among 2 Tanaim. We'll see it's a debate between Rebbe and Rashbag, and that will be the bulk of at least the beginning of tomorrow's daf. Without wishing everyone Shabbat Shalom and B'sorot Tovot.